All right, welcome back. Today we are diving into a philosophical argument for God's existence that honestly works a little differently than most. It's called the transcendental argument, and it really forces us to look at the very foundation of how we think and reason about, well, anything. So, let me just start by asking you a question. How would you go about proving your most basic, fundamental belief? You know, something like, the world outside my head is actually real. You can't really use evidence from the outside world to prove it, right? Because using that evidence already assumes it's real. These kinds of beliefs are the absolute starting points for all our other reasoning.
The philosopher Greg Bahnsen put it really simply. The mind is not neutral. And this gets right to the heart of it. The folks who make this argument say that nobody, absolutely nobody, approaches the world with a totally blank slate. We all have a starting point, a fundamental lens that we see everything through.
Now, the technical term for these starting points is a presupposition. A good way to think about it is like the operating system for your mind. You don't prove your computer's OS is working by using a program that runs on the OS. You just have to assume it's working to even launch the program in the first place. These beliefs are kind of like that. They're the non-negotiable bedrock of any worldview.
And here's the crucial point. Every single one of us has them. This isn't just a thing for theologians or philosophers. If you're a scientist, you presuppose that nature is uniform and that experiments you do today will work the same way tomorrow. If you're an artist, you might presuppose that beauty has some kind of real meaning. Your reasoning always has to start somewhere. So, this idea leads to the argument's first major move. It frames the whole debate not as a disagreement over little individual facts, but as a fundamental clash between two totally competing worldviews. Okay, so here's how the argument sets up that clash. On one side, you've got the Christian worldview. Its starting point, its presupposition, is the God of the Bible. In this view, reality is orderly and makes sense, and we can have knowledge because an intelligent creator designed both the universe and our minds to work together. And then, on the other side, the argument basically groups all other worldviews together, saying their starting point is human reason alone, as the ultimate judge. From that starting point, reality is seen as a product of pure chance, just random, disconnected facts, what some philosophers call brute particulars. And knowledge is really just our minds trying our best to impose some kind of order on all that chaos.
And this brings us right to the argument itself, the transcendental argument for God, or as it's often called, TAG for short.
So here it is, the central claim. The argument is that the Christian God isn't just, one possible explanation out there among many. It's that he is the necessary foundation for everything, for all rational thought, for logic itself, for any sense of meaning. Without this specific starting point, the argument goes, none of those things would even be possible.
Now this is where it gets really clever. TAG doesn't work like your typical argument. It's not going to point to a fossil or a star as evidence to prove its case. It works as an indirect proof.
It's basically a two-step method. First, it puts forward the Christian worldview as the thing that provides the necessary preconditions for making sense of anything, like logic or reason. Then, and this is the key move, it critiques all other worldviews, trying to show that they can't account for those same things. The goal isn't really to prove its own case directly, but to show the impossibility of the contrary. The best way to think about this is to imagine someone trying to argue that air doesn't exist. To even make their case, they have to breathe air to speak the words, right? Their action completely contradicts their claim. Well, the transcendental argument says something very similar is going on when someone uses logic and reason to argue against the Christian God. It's claiming you're using the very tools that only make sense if that God exists. Okay, so that's the theory. Kinda heady, I know. But how does it actually work in practice? Let's run a quick test case on something we all rely on every single day, logic.
Think about it for a second. Where do the laws of logic actually come from? Things like the law of non-contradiction, that A can't be non-A at the same time. We all use it, we all assume it's true everywhere for everyone forever. But what worldview can actually justify that?
According to TAG, this is where a purely materialist worldview hits a major wall. The laws of logic aren't physical objects, You can't put the law of non-contradiction under a microscope. So if everything is just matter and energy, what are they? If they're just, say, chemical reactions in our brains, then they can't be universal or objective. My logic could be totally different from your logic. So the argument asks, how can a universe that's just born of random chance provide a solid foundation for absolute, unchanging, immaterial laws of reason? And the argument then expands this out beyond just logic. It claims that our most fundamental experiences, things like objective morality, and even the practice of science itself, which has to rely on an orderly and uniform universe, all of these things only find a coherent foundation if you start by presupposing the Christian worldview. In that view, logic reflects God's mind, morality reflects his character, and science is possible because he created an orderly cosmos for us to explore.
So all of this builds up to the final and really powerful claim of the entire argument. Cornelius Van Til, who's really the main architect of this argument, summed it up perfectly. He said, "The only proof of the Christian position is that unless its truth is presupposed, there is no possibility of proving anything at all." I mean, just think about that. It's an incredibly bold claim that the Christian worldview isn't just another idea to be proven, but it's the very foundation of proof itself.
So it never tries to prove God from some imaginary neutral starting point. Instead, it concludes by trying to demonstrate what it calls the impossibility of the contrary. The whole point is that any other starting point ultimately collapses on itself, leaving no firm ground for knowledge, logic, or meaning. And that really leaves us all with a final question to think about. This argument forces us to look at our own starting points, our own core beliefs that we take for granted. So, if reason itself truly needs a foundation to stand on, what is yours?